What would you do if 3 fake officers broke into your vault at 2 a.m. and found you waiting for them? The night they broke into my house, I realized this wasn't neighbor drama anymore. It was a power play. The HOA thought they could forge papers, spread rumors, and send men to seize my guns at 2 a.m. But they forgot one thing. I may be off the badge, but I still know the law better than they do. And that night, the steel vault spoke louder than any of us. The night the vault became a trap, the bay was so still I could hear the old halogen bulbs humming above my workbench. Inside my workshop, it was concrete and steel, pegboard on the walls, weld burns on the floor, a battered orange toolbox older than some deputies I used to train. I'd shut off the radio an hour earlier. The only sounds left were ticking metal and the soft buzz of the monitor wall bolted over my welding table. 6 black and white screens watched my world for me. Front gate, gravel drive, porch, rear fence, workshop door, and, dead center, the bright corridor that led into my vault. That was the screen that changed. At first, it was just a gray smear at the edge of the camera's view. Then the motion icon in the corner blinked red, and 3 dark shapes stepped out of the shadows and into the light. They came in stacked up the way they'd seen on TV. Matching dark uniforms, duty belts, boots. Enough to fool a nervous neighbor, not enough to fool someone who'd worn the real thing for 12 years. 2 of them had black masks over their faces. The third, Walking Point, kept his uncovered, jaw lifted, trying hard to look like the man in charge. Even through the fuzzy feed, I could see the sweat shining along his hairline, the cheap gleam of his badge. Not county issue, not any agency I knew, just stamped metal meant to look official hanging crooked on his chest. "Not deputies," I said to the empty shop. They moved down the corridor toward the vault, boots echoing off concrete. At the end of the hall, the vault door stood open the way I'd left it, a dark mouth framed by shelves and hard cases. The leader hesitated half a second at the threshold. Then greed won, and he stepped through. The other 2 followed. I set my wrench down and wiped my hands on the rag tied to my belt, eyes never leaving the screen. Inside the vault, the camera caught them from the side. Rows of gun cases lined the walls. The point man bent and lifted one of my cases off the lower shelf, testing the weight like he was shopping. Behind him, one masked man let out a quick, excited laugh and slapped him on the shoulder. The third hovered by the door, head twitching up toward the camera before he forced himself to look away. They were laughing. In my armory. On my land. I reached for the shotgun leaning against the bench. The walnut stock slid into my shoulder like it had been built for it. I didn't rack around, didn't shout. I just stood there for a long breath, smelling oil and dust and faint salt air sneaking under the door, and let my pulse settle down instead of up. Then I crossed the workshop and stopped beneath the screens. The monitor wall washed everything in a pale glow. In the center frame, the vault corridor burned bright. 3 silhouettes cut sharp against it. On the feed from inside the vault, the men were talking faster, hands chopping through the air. One kicked his tactical bag open and started unzipping pouches. One popped the chicanson, latches on another case that didn't belong to him. The third stood closer to the door than before, shoulders tight like his body knew something his brain hadn't caught up to yet. The control panel sat to the right of the monitors, a square of brushed steel with a row of big metal toggles. A fading label under the bottom switch read "Vault Lock" in my own handwriting. I laid the shotgun back into the crook of my arm and wrapped my thumb around that switch. "Bad night to pick my place," I said quietly. The switch went down with a hard, satisfying click. A half second later, the sound hit. One deep metallic thunk that rolled through the cinder block and straight into my ribs. On the corridor feed, the heavy door jerked, then swung in on hydraulics, smooth and final. Light narrowed to a bar, then a knife edge, then vanished. The bolt slammed home with a second, heavier thud that shook dust from the rafters. Inside the vault, all three men whirled toward the door. The case the leader had been holding hit the concrete and bounced. One masked man threw himself at the steel, palm slapping flat, like he thought he could drag it back open by hand. The third stumbled 2 steps backward until the back of his head met the far wall. Their mouths were moving now. The little speaker above my workbench hissed, then filled with noise. "Hey, open this! Open the door! This isn't funny, man. Come on! Call her! Call her right now! This wasn't the deal!" I let it wash over me and checked the other feeds. On the driveway camera, the gravel lane was empty. On the gate feed, my wooden entrance stood where it always stood. Rough posts and crossbeam. Coal Ranch burned into the top plank. Bay water glinting faintly beyond the fence. From the road, it was just another quiet coastal night. Nobody passing by would know 3 armed men were locked in the safest room on the property. I picked up the shotgun again and walked out of the workshop, down the short hall toward the vault. Their voices got louder with every step. The vault doesn't leak much sound, but fear will press through any crack it can find. Fists hammered the inside of the door in a frantic rhythm. A boot slammed into the lower panel again and again. "Sir, open up. This is an official operation. Just open it. We're authorized to be here. You can't do this. She said you'd cooperate." I stopped 3 feet from the door and let the shotgun rest, muzzle safe toward the floor. The lock light above the frame glowed steady red. The pounding was already starting to slow. The breathing wasn't. In 12 years of wearing a badge, I'd seen what happened when the wrong people got hold of fake authority. These 3 thought uniforms and paperwork from a homeowners association on the other side of the bay meant more than the deed in my safe and the law in this county. They had walked into my house, my armory, with forged orders and borrowed courage. Now they were exactly where they belonged, somewhere they couldn't hurt anyone, with every word and every mistake recorded. I took one slow breath and let it out. They thought they were here to collect property. They thought the HOA's reach stretched over my fence line. They thought whoever sent them could speak louder than the law. Standing in that narrow hallway, listening to 3 trapped men beg behind 6 inches of steel they couldn't budge, one question settled in and refused to leave. Who had sent them? And what made them so sure they had authority on my land? To answer that, I had to rewind the clock 1 week, back to when life on this coastal ranch still felt like something close to normal. The days had been warm and steady then, the kind where the wind carried the smell of salt water up from the inlet, and the grass swayed like it had all the time in the world. My workshop doors were usually propped open, letting the sea breeze slip across the concrete floor, while I worked on weld repairs or some half-finished project that only made sense to me. I'd left the sheriff's office years before, walked out for good on a day when paperwork outweighed police work and the badge felt heavier than it should. After that, I came back to these 20 acres between the foothills and the bay, the same land my father tended before me. Out here, things made sense. The tides, the seasons, the way a fence post leaned after a storm. Steel and soil were honest in a way people didn't always manage to be. For a long time, the land stayed quiet. So did I. Then Pacific Ridge showed up across the inlet, like a rash that spread overnight. 1 month, the property on the far shore was just scrub grass, driftwood, and a handful of cormorants perched on rocks. The next month, it sprouted paved streets, matching mailboxes, polished walkways, and little signs pointing toward homes that hadn't existed a season earlier. And at the top of it all, sitting in a bright new SUV and wearing determination like armor, was Bethany Reed, the newly minted president of the Pacific Ridge Homeowners Association. Bethany talked about protecting community values the way preachers talk about sin. Everything was a threat. Everything needed regulation. And everything, in her mind, was her business. The first time we crossed paths, I was sitting on my porch in the late afternoon sun, cleaning an old lever-action rifle I'd inherited from my grandfather. He carried it in the Cascades back when tracking meant you followed prints in the mud, not a dot on a GPS. The rifle was an heirloom, but cleaning it had always been a way for me to settle my thoughts. Bethany didn't see heritage or routine. She saw danger. She stopped dead in the gravel road, like someone slammed on her internal brakes. Her son, maybe 14, headphones in, eyes half asleep, kept walking until she yanked him back by the sleeve. "Excuse me," she called across my fence. "Is that really appropriate?" I looked up slowly, sun warming the boards of the porch beneath my boots. "Afternoon," I said. "Just maintenance." "This is a residential bay community," she snapped. "People walk here, families, children." Her voice carried like she was addressing a crowd, not one man quietly minding his own business on his own land. "My porch," I reminded her. "My property." And the muzzles pointed at the ground. "Everything's legal and safe." "That doesn't make it acceptable," she said, color rising in her cheeks. "Some of us are trying to create a peaceful environment." Her son hadn't even looked up. The only thing he seemed disturbed by was being forced to stand still. Bethany pulled him toward the HOA development, like she was rescuing him from a wildfire. And that should have been the end of it. An HOA president with too much time on her hands and not enough sense of boundaries. But people like Bethany don't stop at being annoyed. They escalate. They build stories, even if they have to borrow the wood and nails from someone else's reputation. 3 days after that porch encounter, I saw her again. This time she wasn't staring at me. She was staring at my property line, the old wooden gate, the gravel turnout, the bay grass that grew tall along the fence. She stood there a long time, arms crossed, lips pressed into a line, like she was trying to solve a problem no one asked her to solve. That night, a letter showed up in my mailbox, printed on Pacific Ridge HOA letterhead, even though I wasn't part of their development and never would be. It was written in stiff legal language, but the message was plain enough. Your ranch presents a visual hazard. Your activities disturb community tranquility, and the HOA requests formal access for evaluation. Access to my land. My deeded, surveyed, tax-paid, grandfather-worked land. I reread the letter twice under the porch light before letting out a slow breath that tasted too much like warning. Bethany was trying to pull my ranch into her sphere of control, like the bay between us didn't matter, like her rules floated. A week earlier, that idea would have sounded ridiculous. Now, after standing outside a vault sealed shut on 3 impersonators who walked into my home like they owned it, I wasn't sure where her ambitions stopped. The night breeze stirred the bay grass and rattled the chimes hanging from my porch rafters. Somewhere down the hill, the tide was coming in, sliding quietly over rocks. I folded the letter, set it on the porch rail, and told myself there was no reason to worry yet. But even then, before the fake inspections, before the forged paperwork, before the break-in, I could feel something shifting. People don't try to take what isn't theirs unless they think someone will let them. 2 mornings after I got that letter, I was tightening a hinge on the barn door when the dogs barked. One sharp warning, not frantic but alert. I wiped my hands on my jeans and stepped out into the yard. The sun had just cleared the ridge behind the workshop, turning the bay into a sheet of bright silver. Dust floated in the air like pollen, catching the light. At the end of my gravel drive, 3 men stood lined up at the wooden gate. They weren't neighbors. They weren't contractors. And they sure weren't law enforcement, no matter how much they tried to look the part. Each wore the same off-brand Navy uniform with Pacific Ridge Community Safety stitched over the chest. The stitching was uneven, like somebody ordered the patches online and glued them on the night before. Their belts were too clean, their boots too new, and the way they stood, shoulders back, hands behind clipboards, reminded me of teenagers trying to look older by borrowing their father's suit jacket. I walked down the drive, letting the gravel crunch under my boots, and stopped on my side of the gate. "Morning," I said. The man in the center straightened like someone pulled a string down his spine. "Good morning, sir. We're here to conduct a routine firearms safety inspection on behalf of Pacific Ridge HOA. I raised a brow. "You're here for what?" "A safety inspection," he repeated, smiling as if that explained anything. "There have been reports of visible firearms on adjacent properties, and we're required to ensure all storage complies with community safety standards." I leaned a forearm on the gate, feeling the wood warm beneath the sun. "Adjacent properties," I echoed. "You realize this ranch isn't part of your HOA." He held out a sheet of paper, printed, stamped, and very official-looking to somebody who'd never seen the real thing. "Per HOA Policy Section 7B, we're authorized to inspect any property that may pose a community risk." I didn't take it. Didn't need to. Even from a foot away, the problems were obvious. County seal tilted wrong, font mismatched, legal phrasing stitched together like a patchwork quilt, and the signature at the bottom was a little too perfect, like it had been dragged in from a scanned image. Behind the leader, the youngest guard shifted from foot to foot, eyes fixed on the gravel. He couldn't have been older than 20, clean-cut, nervous, fingers tapping the corner of his clipboard like he was trying to bleed out the guilt. "You gentlemen practiced this in the mirror?" I asked calmly. The leader blinked. "Sir, refusal to cooperate may result in an HOA violation." I almost laughed. "I don't live in your HOA. Your violation means as much to me as driftwood on the tide." His smile twitched, then returned, tighter than before. "We still need to complete the inspection." "No," I said. "Sir, no." I didn't raise my voice. Didn't have to. "Turn around and walk back to wherever you came from." The younger guard finally looked up, just for a heartbeat. And in that heartbeat, I saw it. He knew this was wrong. He knew they didn't belong here. Then he looked away again. The leader opened his mouth, probably to recite some memorized line about authority, but the dogs barked again from behind me, sharper this time. The man glanced toward the barn, then toward the workshop, and whatever bravery he'd brought with him began to crack. "We'll be reporting non-compliance," he said stiffly. "You do that," I replied. They backed off faster than they meant to, turning as a group and walking down the road toward the HOA development. The moment they were out of sight, the younger guard let his shoulders drop, as if he'd been holding his breath the entire time. I watched until they rounded the bend and disappeared. The morning felt different after that. The sunlight was the same, the tide still creeping up over the rocks, but something in the air tightened. A thread pulled taut. An HOA doesn't send 3 fake officers to your property for nothing. As I headed back toward the barn, a question settled heavy in my chest. If this was their first attempt, what would be their second? I didn't have to wait long to find out. 2 days later, I drove into town for diesel. The roads were quiet, the kind of late-morning lull when most folks were already at work, and the only sound was the soft hiss of tires on old pavement. The bay glimmered behind me, reflecting clouds that hung low and pale. Nothing felt wrong, until I stepped into the hardware store. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. 3 people near the counter lowered their voices. Another man, someone I'd known for years, nodded at me but looked away just as fast, like he wasn't sure if saying hello would get him dragged into something. I paid for my diesel additive and stepped outside with a knot forming in my stomach. When a town this small changes its temperature, You feel it like a cold draft under a door. Back at the ranch, the answer was waiting in my mailbox. A glossy flyer, printed in color, heavier paper than any HOA newsletter I'd ever seen. My gate was on the front, photographed from the county road. Beneath it, big red letters shouted, "Unstable ex-officer, stockpiling weapons, community safety risk." I stared at it in the sun, the breeze tugging lightly at the corner of the page. Someone had gone to real effort here. Budget, print shop, distribution. They hadn't even bothered to hide the HOA logo down in the corner. I turned it over. The back listed a series of concerns, each written like a warning label. Visible firearms, erratic behavior, potential threat to families. None of it true, none of it grounded in a shred of evidence. But truth doesn't matter when fear is cheaper and spreads faster. I walked the length of the fence line and found more of them, tucked under the cattle gate, pinned beneath a rock near the workshop path. Someone had been busy. When the crunch of tires rolled up my drive, I didn't need to look to know who it was. Sheriff Marcus Hale stepped out of his cruiser with his hat low, thumbs hooked casually into his belt. But his expression wasn't casual at all. "Afternoon, Remy," he said. "Marcus?" He held up a stack of papers thick enough to choke a paper shredder. "These all came in today," he said. "Anonymous reports from Pacific Ridge. A lot of them." I flipped through a few. Complaint after complaint, each one twisting a harmless moment into something sinister. Someone had seen me carrying a rifle case from the truck to the workshop, labeled brandishing firearms aggressively. Someone reported I'd been pacing the property erratically when I was walking the dogs. Someone claimed they feared for their safety because I lived near the bay, isolated and mentally unstable. "Who wrote these?" I asked. "Hard to say," Hale said, jaw tightening. "Signatures are vague, descriptions almost identical. Like a template." We both knew what that meant. I set the flyers and complaints on my porch rail. The paper fluttered wildly in the wind, snapping like tiny flags. "They want to build a case," I said. Hale nodded once. "And if they can't build one," he added, "they might try forging one." The breeze stiffened, blowing the scent of salt water through the porch posts. Somewhere out near the inlet, a gull cawed, long and sharp. "This enough for them to file a petition?" I asked. "Maybe," Hale said. "Depends on the judge. Depends on who's whispering in whose ear." He leaned against the railing. "Remy, I've known you a long time. You're steady, level-headed. But these folks?" He tapped the stack of papers. "They're not playing by the normal handbook." I looked toward the ridge where the HOA development sat. Gleaming roofs, manicured yards, and rules thick enough to use as a doorstop. A whole different world across a thin stretch of water. "Bethany's behind this," I said. Hale didn't disagree. "She's pushing hard, real hard, and she's got most of her board wound up tight." "Any idea why she's so determined?" I asked. He pushed his hat back slightly. "I think you embarrassed her, Remy. And people like her don't let that go, not when they think control is slipping." The flyers rustled again, edges flapping against one another. A whisper campaign, a manufactured threat, a story they wanted the town to believe, so that when the time came to act against me, no one would be surprised. No one would question it. Hale exhaled through his nose. "Keep your head, keep your records, and don't let 'em draw you out." "I won't," I said. "But they're not stopping." "No," he said softly. "They're just getting started." He climbed back into his cruiser, gravel popping under the tires as he eased down the drive. The dust rose behind him in a slow, drifting cloud, settling over the fence posts like a warning. I picked up one of the flyers again and looked at my own gate staring back at me from the page. A picture twisted into a threat. "Lies don't scare me. But lies with a strategy? Those will keep a man awake. And if this was their second move, their third would be worse. That prediction proved itself quicker than I expected. 3 mornings later, the bay was wrapped in a thin layer of fog, the kind that settles over the water like a blanket and turns the world soft and gray. The workshop lights glowed faintly through the haze as I tightened bolts on a steel bracket for the barn. It was quiet. Too quiet. Even the gulls held their tongues. Then the dogs growled. Not a bark, not a warning, but the low rumble they save for something that doesn't belong. I wiped my hands, stepped out from under the workshop awning, and followed their eyes toward the gate. A black SUV idled at the end of my gravel drive. 4 men stood in front of it. 3 wore the same fake uniforms I'd seen before. Navy blue wannabe security, badges pinned just crooked enough to betray the lie. But the 4th man, he wasn't like them. He wore a gray suit, expensive but creased from nerves. He carried a leather folder tucked under one arm. His haircut screamed committee boardroom, not law enforcement. And when he saw me approaching, he straightened his tie the way a man does when he's about to say something he knows he shouldn't. I stopped on my side of the gate. "Morning," I said, though the air felt anything but friendly. The suited man smiled, thin and wobbling. "Mr. Cole, I presume? I'm Richard Fallon, legal advisor for the Pacific Ridge Community Association." He opened the folder with a little flourish, holding a document toward me without fully extending it, like he wanted credit for presenting it without letting me touch it. "We're here to deliver an official mandatory safety inspection order regarding your firearms storage." I let my eyes drift down the page, not touching it, just close enough to read the printing. County letterhead, wrong size. Margin spacing, wrong again. Paragraph formatting, sloppy, like someone copied bits of real judicial language and pasted them together without understanding any of it. The signature? Photocopied, not even aligned straight. I exhaled, slow. "You didn't write this," I said to Fallon. His throat bobbed. "The HOA board approved it. I was instructed." "You're not county," I cut in. "You have no jurisdiction, and this isn't an order, it's a prop." Behind him, one of the uniformed men shifted uncomfortably. Another adjusted his mask. The third kept glancing at the fog behind him, as if hoping it would swallow him whole. Fallon forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Cole, refusal to comply may result in—" "There's no refusal here," I said. "There's nothing to comply with." I leaned my forearm over the top rail of my gate, letting the silence stretch just a little too long. "This is the second time your HOA has sent a fake document to my property. You forging court orders now?" Fallon's lips parted, but no words came out. His grip on the leather folder tightened. One of the uniformed men whispered, "We shouldn't be here." His voice cracked like an overstretched rope. Young, early 20s. Same nervous tapping on the clipboard as before. Fallon shot him a glare sharp enough to cut. The fog thickened around us, muting the world into gray tones. Somewhere across the inlet, a buoy bell clanged faintly. The kind of sound that makes a man feel the distance between the truth and a lie. I pulled my phone from my pocket. "Sheriff Hale," I said simply. "This is Remy. I've got Pacific Ridge here again with another forged inspection order." Fallon's face drained of color. "No need to escalate this," he said quickly. I ignored him. "They claim they're here for mandatory access." "We'll be gone," Fallon whispered frantically. "We'll leave right now." But it was already too late. Sheriff Marcus Hale's cruiser appeared through the fog like something carved out of blue steel. He parked behind their SUV, stepped out with a slowness that said he'd already made up his mind. "Gentlemen," he said, "let's see the paperwork." Fallon held it out, but not with confidence, more like a man offering a rattlesnake by the tail. Hale didn't touch it. He leaned in, reading it from inches away. Silence. Then a short, humorless snort. "This is fake," Hale said. "Badly fake." Fallon swallowed hard. "Sheriff, we were advised—" "You were advised wrong." Hale's voice dropped, steady and cutting. "You do not enforce anything in this county. Not on private land, not with forged documents." Behind him, the young uniformed man stepped back, boots crunching over gravel. Hale looked over the group. "You boys need to turn around and leave this property immediately. And if I see another piece of forged paper come across my desk, the DA will get it before I finish my morning coffee." The men didn't argue. They didn't speak. They didn't even look back at me. They just walked, fast, and climbed into their SUV like men who suddenly realized the ground beneath them wasn't ground at all, but thin ice. As their taillights vanished down the county road, Hale stayed by the gate. The fog curled around him like smoke. "Remy," he said quietly, "they're not just pushing boundaries. They're stepping into felony territory." "I know. This isn't over." "I know that too." The sheriff looked toward the HOA development across the inlet, the rooftops barely visible through the mist. "They're desperate," he said, "and desperate people do stupid things." He tipped his hat and headed back to his cruiser. I stood there a while, the flyer still folded in my pocket, the forged order fresh in my mind. The fog thinned slowly, revealing the dock down the hill, the glint of sunlight returning to the water, the distant roofs of Pacific Ridge Community. If this was their third move, their fourth would be something worse. The dogs had gone quiet beside me, ears up, watching the road like they sensed a shift coming. And maybe they were right. The air felt thick, almost metallic, like a storm was hiding somewhere behind the ridge even though the sky stayed stubbornly clear. By late afternoon, the fog burned off completely. The sun dipped low, laying long streaks of gold across the grass. I spent the day pretending to focus on repairs, the kind you do more to keep your hands busy than because they need doing. But every time I turned a wrench, the forged order flashed in my mind like a warning flare. I was oiling the hinges on the back gate when gravel shifted up near the road. At first I thought it was Hale again, or worse, another group of HOA men in borrowed uniforms. I stepped slowly toward the fence line, boots brushing through dry grass. The sun cast everything in that early evening amber, flattening shadows and making distance hard to judge. Then a single figure emerged from the bend of the road. Not four men, not uniforms, just one. Young, shoulders slumped, a navy Pacific Ridge security shirt hanging too loose on his frame. And in his hands, held out in front of him like it might explode, was a manila envelope. Jake Mercer. The same guard whose eyes had betrayed more truth than his clipboard earlier in the week. He stopped a few feet from my gate, breathing hard like he'd been wrestling with the decision to come here all the way from the HOA development to my fence. "Mr. Cole," he said, barely above a whisper. I need to talk to you." His voice carried that kind of tremble you hear when someone finally steps off the path they were pushed onto and onto one they chose themselves. I rested my hands on the top rail of the gate. "You alone?" He nodded quickly. "Yeah, they don't know I'm here." The dogs came up behind me but stayed quiet, which said more than anything else. Animals know guilt when they smell it. They know fear, too. Jake had both. "Go ahead," I said. He swallowed. "You were right. About everything. The papers were fake. The uniforms. Half of us didn't even know where they came from." He licked his lips. "But it's worse than that." I didn't move. Didn't try to fill the silence. Just let him say whatever he'd come here to say. He held up the envelope. "This has the budget records, emails, Meeting logs, plans. His hands shook harder. They're going after your guns, Mr. Cole. Not legally. Not through the sheriff. They hired contractors from out of town. My jaw tightened. Not in anger, just in confirmation. Jake kept talking, voice cracking wide open. Bethany, she's been calling it retrieval night. Says you're a risk. Says you won't cooperate unless forced. He took a ragged breath. She scheduled it between 1 and 3 in the morning. The same quiet hours when even law-abiding men sleep deepest. When? I asked. Tomorrow night, he whispered. Breeze came down the ridge, stirring the bay grass, brushing dust loose from the gatepost. It carried the distant sound of a boat engine out on the water, soft, steady, utterly unaware of the storm building on land. What else? I asked. Jake flinched and rubbed the back of his neck. She forged my initials on the invoices. If the sheriff found out, or the DA, it would all point to me. He blinked fast, fighting something, fear, shame, maybe both. I didn't sign anything. I swear it. The last bit tumbled out in a rush, the way truth fights to escape once a man lets it. Inside the envelope, I could hear papers shifting, heavy papers, thick with numbers and signatures and evidence, the kind of weight that crushes lies if handled right. I didn't take it from him yet. Why come to me? I asked quietly. He lifted his eyes, and for the first time since I'd met him, they didn't dart away. They stayed pinned on mine. Because she's going to blame me if it blows up, he said. She already drafted a statement saying I authorized everything, said I mishandled funds, said I hired the contractors. I let that sit there between us, long enough for the truth of it to settle like silt in water. You did the right thing coming here, I said finally. He exhaled so sharply his shoulders sagged. Then he pushed the envelope through a gap in the gate's wooden slats, hands shaking, as if afraid even the act of giving it to me might get him caught. I took it. Jake stepped back once, then again, then stopped. You're not the man she says you are, he said. Most of us know that now. His voice cracked on the last word, and before I could respond, he turned and hurried up the gravel road, vanishing around the same bend he'd appeared from, not running, but not walking slow either, like he was trying to outrun the fear of what might happen if anyone saw him here. The sun had nearly dropped behind the ridge. The sky above the bay burned orange at the edges, fading into purple. The breeze picked up and lifted strands of dust from the road. I looked down at the envelope in my hand. It felt heavier than paper should feel. Inside was every detail of their plan, every dollar they'd shifted, every timeline they'd built, every illegal move they'd signed their names, or Jake's name, too. Tomorrow night. Between 1 and 3 a.m., a bad time for decent men, but a perfect time to catch fools breaking into the wrong damn house. I locked the gate, walked the long gravel path back toward the workshop, and felt something I hadn't felt since my badge days. Not fear, not anger, but clarity. If they were coming tomorrow night, then tonight was for preparation. The bay wind pushed against my back as I crossed the yard, carrying the clean smell of salt water and distant kelp. The workshop door creaked softly when I opened it, metal hinges complaining the way old hinges do when something big is about to happen. Inside, the yellow industrial lamps buzzed awake, throwing long shadows across the concrete floor. My tools gleamed where I'd left them. Welders, clamps, steel rods, a grinder still dusted from earlier work. None of it threatening. All of it useful. I set the manila envelope Jake had given me on the steel table and opened it carefully. Paper slid out in thick, uneven layers, screenshots of emails, invoices bearing forged initials, transfer logs showing HOA funds funneled to out-of-town contractors, and tucked between the pages, a printed timeline labeled Retrieval Night. It spelled out everything: times, roles, entry points, exit plan. They hadn't left anything to imagination. For a moment, I just stood there, one hand braced on the edge of the table. It wasn't the threat that hit hardest. It was the arrogance. They truly believed they had the right to walk into a man's home at 2 a.m. and take whatever they wanted. They believed forged authority would carry them farther than legal truth ever could. That was the moment clarity slipped clean into place. They'd built their plan. Now I would build mine. I crossed the workshop and flipped open the panel hidden behind a metal cabinet. A row of industrial switches stared back at me. The security controls I'd wired myself years ago. Each toggle had a purpose. Floodlights, motion sensors, vault door override, silent alarm. I switched the floodlights to half power, bathing the outer acre in a soft glow. Just enough to show silhouettes, not enough to scare intruders off. They would think I'd gone to bed early. They would think the ranch was quiet. Next, I tested the silent alarm, the one Sheriff Hale had personally signed off on after a series of break-ins in the county 2 summers back. A single light blinked green, sending a discreet signal directly to Hale's phone. It wouldn't ring loud. It wouldn't alert the intruders. But Hale would know exactly when someone crossed onto my land. I walked to the wall of monitors and powered them on. The screens lit up, turning the workshop into a command center. The front gate, the drive, the porch, the barn, the back fence. Every angle stitched into view like pieces of a quilt. And dead center, the bright, narrow corridor leading into my vault. I zoomed in until the interior walls came into crisp focus. Clean steel, reinforced doorframe, overhead lamp casting sharp light onto the polished concrete floor. The vault didn't look like a trap, and that was its greatest strength. I walked down the hall and stood in front of the real door. The steel wheel was cold beneath my palm. I turned it slowly and stepped inside. The air changed immediately, cooler, quieter, holding the faint smell of gun oil and fresh paint. Racks lined both walls, each weapon locked, tagged, and documented. Not a single one stored illegally. Not a single one unaccounted for. I'd spent years building this vault not out of fear, but out of habit. Old habits from badge days, when organization meant safety. I looked up at the ceiling speaker, wired neatly beside the camera. Tomorrow night, when the door slammed shut, the men inside would hear my voice through that speaker. Not yelling, not threatening, just calm, like the last page of a report. Back in the workshop, I dimmed the interior lights until only the screens glowed. The place felt like a heartbeat now, steady, controlled, waiting. Preparation finished. I pulled up a chair and sat at the workbench. The dogs settled near my boots, both watching the monitor wall like they understood exactly what was coming. Outside, the tide had reached its highest point, lapping softly at the rocks below the bluff. A night breeze drifted through the half-open door, carrying with it the faint scent of cedar and bay water. I closed the envelope Jake had given me and slid it into a heavy-duty evidence bag. Tomorrow, Hale would get the real story. Not rumors, not complaints, evidence. But for tonight, the ranch was quiet again. Not peaceful, quiet. The kind of quiet that gathers before a storm breaks. I leaned back, hands folded loosely in my lap, and let the workshop settle around me. Tomorrow night, I wouldn't be pacing or panicking. I'd be here, watching the monitors, letting the HOA's hired thieves walk straight into the brightest lit hallway in the county. The vault wasn't built to catch criminals, but tomorrow, it would do exactly that. Night came slowly, sliding over the bay like a dark sheet pulled tight across the water. By midnight, the only light left was the faint orange glow from the marina miles away and the steady blink from the channel marker. The dogs lay near my boots, awake but still, every few minutes lifting their heads to listen. 1:07 a.m. Nothing yet. I watched the monitors, each frame quiet and still, gate untouched, porch empty, workshop door closed behind me. The half-power floodlights glowed softly over the outer acre, bright enough to carve clean silhouettes across the ground, but dim enough to hide the fact that every inch of it was being recorded. 1:26 a.m. The dogs lifted their heads at the same time. A second later, one soft ping from camera 3. South fence. Movement low to the ground. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, watching as two figures crawled through the shadows of the bay grass. Both wore dark clothes. The taller one carried himself like someone who thought watching tactical videos online meant he knew tactics. The shorter man had a heavy backpack dragging at his shoulders. One look told me it was full of break-in tools. They paused near the old cattle path. The tall one pointed toward my house. Then they moved. No grace, no discipline, no understanding of how sound travels in open nighttime air. Just two hired amateurs stumbling toward a felony. 1:41 a.m. They reached the porch. One tried the doorknob, locked, of course. The other pulled out a pry bar, wedging it under the deadbolt plate. He mouthed something I read easily off his lips. Plan B. He dug into his bag and pulled out a spring-loaded glass punch. The tool gleamed briefly under the floodlight as he pressed it to the small side window. Pop. A clean, sharp crack. Both slipped inside like raccoons breaking into a pantry. I keyed the radio Hale had given me. Sheriff Hale, this is Remy. Intruders confirmed inside. 2 suspects moving down the hall. Hale's voice came back calm, steady, the way a man sounds when he's already halfway out the door. Copy. Units rolling. 7 to 9 minutes. Don't engage unless necessary. Wouldn't dream of it, I said. I set the radio down and turned back to the hall cam. The 2 men swept their way through the rooms, if you could call it sweeping. Elbows too wide, barrels pointing everywhere, steps heavy enough to wake a sleeping herd. The tall one whispered, Bethany said the armory's at the back. Bethany. They always say the quiet part out loud when they think no one's listening. Camera 6 lit up as they entered the corridor to the vault. The tall man whistled under his breath, awed by the racks, the lights, the clean steel door waiting open just a crack. He pulled a folded document from his vest pocket, the forged seizure order, and flashed it at his partner like it gave him legitimacy. It didn't. It just gave me evidence. He stuffed it back in his vest and stepped inside. I let them go 3 steps, deeper. 4. 5. Then I pressed the button. Kate Chank. The vault door slammed shut with a steel-on-steel echo that shook the workshop wall behind me. Both men spun, scrambling toward the door, but the wheel wouldn't budge, not with the magnetized lock and the reinforced deadbolt engaged. Inside the vault, chaos bloomed instantly. What the? It locked! It locked! This wasn't part of a— Call her! Call her! I turned on the audio feed. Their panic filled the workshop like a distant, muffled storm. I clicked the mic for the ceiling speaker inside the vault. Breaking into my home was brave, I said calmly, my voice echoing off steel. Breaking into my armory was suicidal. Silence slapped the room flat. Then the shorter man started pounding on the door, voice cracking in panic. We were told it was legal. She said it was legal. She didn't need a name. The law would supply it soon enough. Red and blue lights began flashing across the far tree line. 2 cruisers rolled up the drive, dirt kicking behind their tires like smoke. Sheriff Hale stepped out first, hat pulled low, posture steady as a mountain. I assume you've got them secured, he said, walking toward me. Vault door, I replied. They're not going anywhere. Hale listened for 2 seconds to the muffled shouting through the steel and nodded. That's intent, trespass, conspiracy, and stupidity stacked together. Judge will have a field day. He signaled to his deputy. Let's harvest them. I keyed in the release code. The magnets disengaged with a deep, heavy clunk. I cracked the door open 2 inches. The tall man stumbled backward, hands raised high, eyes wide with terror. The shorter one dropped straight to his knees, babbling words that tripped over themselves. "Sheriff's office," Hale said, voice firm. "Step out slow, hands visible." They obeyed instantly, their plan collapsing faster than their courage. As they were cuffed and led outside, the shorter thief shouted through the open cruiser door. "Bethany told us. She said it was community safety. She hired us." Hale closed the door gently, not angrily, like sealing the last page of a report. "Remy," he said, "this isn't a break-in anymore. This is a case." And as he drove away with the 2 felons shouting her name like a siren in the dark, I looked back toward the bay, where the HOA's houses glowed faintly across the water. Tonight had been the trap. Tomorrow would be the reckoning. The Travis County Courthouse sat at the top of a hill that overlooked 3 highways and half a dozen ranches. On most days it looked ordinary. Brick walls, clean steps, flags stirring in the wind. But the morning of the hearing, it felt like the edge of something sharp. Folks from town lingered on the front steps. A few HOA residents clustered together under the shade of the live oak, whispering fiercely, looking anywhere but at me. Inside, the courtroom hummed with a different kind of tension. Tight, quiet, the kind that sticks to the walls. The benches were already half full. Ranchers, fishermen, retirees, people who'd known me for years, and others who'd only known the rumors. Some nodded as I walked past. Some avoided eye contact. Fear clings longer than truth. Sheriff Hale sat behind the prosecution's table, arms folded, expression carved from stone. He gave me one small nod, the kind of nod that says the facts were on our side, but the fight wasn't done yet. I took a seat behind the county prosecutor, a sharp, focused woman named Davis. Her suit was clean, her folders neatly stacked, her expression unbothered. She handled truth the way a rancher handles barbed wire, careful, firm, and without apology. Then the doors opened again. Bethany Reed walked in. She carried herself like the queen of a tiny kingdom, chin up, hair perfect, posture stiff enough to snap. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at anyone. She walked straight to the plaintiff's table and whispered fiercely to a man in a gray suit. Her attorney. The same oily-looking type who thrives on HOA bylaws and technicalities. The judge entered, a woman with silver hair, sharp eyes, and zero tolerance for nonsense. We all rose, then sat again. The clerk read the case title aloud. Pacific Ridge Community Association versus Mr. Remy Cole. Petition for forced access, compliance, and inspection rights. Hale snorted so softly only those near him heard. Bethany's lawyer rose first. He straightened his tie, turned on a bright display screen, and launched into a polished speech about community safety, inconsistencies in firearm storage, and pattern of behavior causing neighborhood concern. Then he clicked a remote. Grainy footage from my property flickered across the courtroom TV. Me carrying a gun case from the barn, me locking the workshop door, me on the porch, cleaning a lever-action rifle. All cut together to look ominous. Edited. Selective. Cropped. He didn't include the part where I followed every safety rule. He didn't include the porch rail pointed away from all homes. He didn't include the fact that it was my land. Bethany nodded along, lips pursed in satisfaction. But the moment he sat down, Prosecutor Davis stood, and the temperature in the room changed. "No further commentary," she said. "Let's show the court what actually happened." She tapped her laptop. The screen lit again, this time with truth. Clear footage of the 2 intruders creeping across my yard, the window breaking. Their whispered words. Bethany said it's legal. The forged papers flashing in their hands. The two men stepping into the vault corridor, and the steel door slamming shut behind them. The audio filled the courtroom next. "Call her! Call Bethany! She said the order was real. She hired us for retrieval." Gasps rippled through the benches. Even a few HOA residents jerked upright. Bethany froze, her hands gripping the table until her knuckles turned white. But Davis wasn't finished. She lifted the evidence bag containing the documents Jake had given me. The county seal glinted under the fluorescent lights. "Your Honor," she said, "this includes bank transfers, forged signatures, unreported expenditures totaling $52,400, and a complete timeline labeled Retrieval Night, all approved, directed, and coordinated by President Bethany Reed." Bethany's attorney jumped up. "Objection!" "Sit down," the judge said, without looking at him. Then Davis called Jake Mercer. The young guard walked slowly to the stand, paler than I'd ever seen him, but steady. When he swore in, his voice cracked, but only once. "Tell the court what you told us," Davis said. Jake took a breath. "Bethany ordered everything," he said. "She hired the contractors. She forged the paperwork. She told the board that Mr. Cole was unstable. She said the break-in would be legal because she'd handle the court after." His hands tightened. "She forged my initials, too. So if things went bad, she could blame me." Bethany exploded to her feet. "That is a lie! He's—" The judge slammed her gavel. "Sit down, Ms. Reed, or I will have you removed." Bethany sank slowly back into her chair, face drained of all color. The judge flipped through the file, page after page, her expression growing harder each minute. When she finally closed it, the sound echoed across the courtroom like a wooden hammer striking stone. Her ruling was crisp. "Petition denied," she said. "Denied with prejudice." A murmur swept through the room. The judge continued, voice sharp as a blade. "Furthermore, due to evidence of forgery, conspiracy, unlawful impersonation of legal authority, and attempted unlawful seizure of private property, this matter is being forwarded to the district attorney immediately." Bethany's mouth fell open. Her attorney went limp. Sheriff Hale smiled, not wide but enough. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The judge wasn't done. "Mr. Cole," she said, "your restraint and thorough documentation demonstrate commendable discipline. This court rarely sees such clarity in a case muddied by public rumor. Well done." I nodded respectfully. When the gavel came down, the echo carried through the courtroom like a final verdict on months of lies. As everyone stood to leave, Bethany finally looked at me. It wasn't anger, it wasn't even fear. It was the hollow expression of someone who finally understood she wasn't fighting me. She was fighting the law. And the law had already won. The next morning, the Bay air was cool and sharp, the kind that wakes a man up before the coffee does. I stepped onto my porch with a mug in hand, letting the steam rise into the early breeze. The inlet was calm, flat as glass, with the sun just beginning to push a gold line across the water. You'd never know anything was wrong in Pacific Ridge unless you listened close. Every so often, a far-off shout, a slammed door, the sound of a neighborhood unraveling. At 9:12 a.m., I got a text from Jake. "They're here." That was all it said, but it was enough. I set the mug down, walked to the end of my property, and stood at the fence line overlooking the HOA across the bay. Two sheriff's cruisers rolled past the manicured sign at the entrance, Pacific Ridge Community, letters painted in white over polished stone. The same sign Bethany once posed beside for a newsletter photo, smiling like she owned the entire shoreline. This time, the deputies didn't slow down. They drove straight to her house. Neighbors emerged from their driveways, drawn by the sudden blue and red glow flashing across the tight suburban street. Some held phones, some whispered, most just stared. I watched from across the water as Sheriff Hale stepped out of his cruiser, hat pulled low, posture calm but final, the way a man walks when all the paperwork is already in place. Bethany opened her front door, wearing a white blouse and the same rigid posture she'd marched into the courtroom with. But this time her confidence cracked at the edges, like a porcelain plate dropped once and glued back together wrong. "This is unnecessary," she said, her voice trembling. "This is retaliatory. This is—" Hale didn't flinch. "Bethany Reed," he said, "you are under arrest." Her face collapsed inward. "For what? I've done nothing illegal. I was protecting my community." Hale began reading the charges, steady and clear. Forgery of legal documents, criminal conspiracy, unlawful impersonation of law enforcement authority, misuse of HOA funds, attempted unlawful seizure of private property. The list went on, and with every word, her neighborhood inched closer. People she once commanded now watching her fold beneath a weight she'd built herself. When Hale turned her around and cuffed her wrists, a few neighbors gasped. One muttered, "I knew something wasn't right." Another whispered, $50,000? On what? A woman shook her head and said, "I told her not to mess with that rancher." Bethany's voice rose, high and desperate, echoing down the cul-de-sac. "This isn't over, Cole. Do you hear me? This isn't—" Her words cut off when the cruiser door closed with a soft but definitive thunk. Hale looked across the bay toward my land. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just gave a small nod, a lawman's way of saying it's done. The cruisers rolled away, carrying the last piece of Pacific Ridge's illusion of power, but the, boom, story of their downfall was only beginning. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, the HOA board held an emergency meeting at the clubhouse. Voices carried across the water, frantic, sharp, confused. I didn't need to hear the words to understand the tone. Panic. By nightfall, the announcement came over their community bulletin. All HOA operations suspended pending state review. 2 weeks later, the state's ruling came down fast and surgical. Charter dissolved. Every account frozen. Board removed. Financial overseer appointed. Pacific Ridge community, once polished and proud, cracked apart like a sandbar hit by a rising tide. Jake came by my place the next morning, not in uniform, not holding a clipboard, just standing at my gate with his hands in his pockets and a tired expression. "I didn't want it to go this far," he said softly. "I know," I replied. "And I did." He hesitated. "Do you hate us?" I shook my head. "No, but my gate stays closed." He let out a small laugh, real, unforced, finally free of fear. "Fair enough," he said. Life didn't snap back to normal after that. It settled, slow, steady, into something better. The county dropped off documents for me to sign, closing out the case. Hale sent a message. "DA says solid case. Good work." Neighbors in town, even the ones who'd believed the rumors, stopped me to offer handshakes, pies, apologies, said with lowered eyes. I accepted them. Not because I needed them, but because holding on to bitterness weighs a man down more than any set of iron chains. A week later, I rebuilt my eastern fence, set new posts, poured fresh concrete, welded steel bollards deep enough to stop a truck. When the final post settled in place, I hung a new sign. Not fancy, just honest. Private land trespass at your own risk, HOA, has no jurisdiction. As evening rolled in, I stood there with a mug of coffee cooling in my hand. The bay breeze rustled through the grass, dogs resting beside me, the quiet no longer feeling fragile. It felt earned. The tide slid in slow and patient, touching the rocks with a soft hush. Sunlight flickered across the surface like it was sealing the whole stretch of coastline with a final blessing of peace. I let my palm run along the rough cedar post and said it the only way a man like me ever needs to say it. My land, my rules. Protected, not by fear, but by the law that still means something out here. Out here, a man only keeps what he's willing to stand up for. And sometimes, that's all the justice you need. If you'd hold your ground the same way, type yes in the comments. Or just drop a simple justice so I know you're with me. And if you enjoy stories where truth still wins in the end, I'd be glad to have you stick around. Go ahead and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.